Okay, Callie Babbitt probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. Callie got her bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology and her master's and PhD from the University of Florida in Gainesville. And she was just back there last week giving a guest lecture to her alma mater, one of her alma maters. She has been at RIT since 2009, and I was trying to figure out how long that is, and I think it's 16 and a half years. She came as an assistant professor, then she became an associate professor, and now she's a full professor of sustainability there. In 2019, she was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship, and she got an early career award from the National Science Foundation. There's other awards too, but I'm going to stop there. At RIT, her research group aims to create circular economy solutions to recover value from waste streams, including food waste, which she's going to be talking about today, consumer electronics, plastics, and lithium-ion batteries. She's written a book, and it's called Sustainable Food Waste to Energy Systems, so she is exactly the right person to be presenting to us today. She's also written journal articles on that topic. She speaks all over the world. She, as I said, was just in Florida, but she's also spoken in Italy and Paris and probably Croatia, because I know she's been there for a sabbatical. You'll probably remember her daughter, Nora, who's a sophomore at RIT, and her husband, Greg, who's a biology professor at RIT. So, Callie, we are so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you all for having me. It's always fun to chat to this group because, you know, it's rare that I get to speak to an audience who's already so passionate about sustainability and already doing a lot of the things that we say to do versus an audience that I have to convince. But I'll share with you some thoughts about food waste today. And as Carolyn mentioned, this really fits into sort of this broader area of research that we're doing at the Golisano Institute for Sustainability at RIT. We have graduate programs in sustainability and architecture, and we do a lot of work with the community, with industry partners, with governments, and with the campus as a living laboratory. And our primary mission is really about trying to find solutions to global challenges. And waste is clearly one of those challenges. But our group, and what will kind of inform this whole discussion, doesn't think about waste as a problem. I like to think that waste is just a resource that's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so much of our work is about identifying how to take what could be a resource and put it back into productive use. And we do that for a lot of things. I'll talk a lot about food today, but like Carolyn mentioned, electronics and electric vehicles and anything that we currently discard is what we sort of call this linear economy. We take resources, we make stuff with them, and then we throw them away, make waste, and instead trying to keep things in productive use in a circular economy. Now, the other thing I would emphasize at the start is that when we talk about sustainability and what we teach our students is that sustainability isn't just about the environment. We describe sustainability as being a three-legged stool. One of those legs is society, one is the economy, and one is the environment. And I'm not like a product designer, but I know that if you cut off one of those legs, the stool will fall over. And that's the exact point that we really try to emphasize in our teaching and research, that you can't just have a solution that's good for the environment. It has to create jobs, it has to save money, it has to be economically viable, it has to help people and make the world a better place and for it to truly be sustainable. And the food system and food waste is clearly an example of the need for this sort of triple bottom line approach. In this graph, what you see here is the percentage of things that give rise to impacts like greenhouse gases, land use, and biodiversity loss. And you'll notice that the food we actually eat in green, and the food that we discard in that light orange color comprise a significant percentage of each of these environmental impacts. It contributes to about 25% of greenhouse gases and climate change worldwide, and over 90% of our biodiversity loss. So in other words, we're dumping immense resources into growing and producing food, chemicals, energy, water, labor, money. And then most of that food much of that food does not actually get eaten. The estimate is that about 30% of food that we produce in the United States is never consumed. And at the same time, there's a whole social dimension to this. So this is an image of a food redistribution event that was taking place during COVID. And I think we all saw that an event like that really laid bare the inequities in our food system. So while we have immense waste happening, immense resource consumption happening, we also have huge inequities. So there are millions of people who do not get adequate nutrition, and that food is an extremely major part of our bills, and even more so as food prices rise. And so if we think about sort of what happens along this food supply chain, is that all along this pathway, sort of from what we call farm to fork, food is wasted. Some of it is consumed, but much is lost along the way. And that relates to about 1,250 calories or 1 pound of food per day. And there's one estimate that says the average U.S. household spends $1,500 on food that's wasted. Now, you might be thinking, like, my grocery bill is not that big, it can't be meat, but really that's about adding up all of the food that gets lost, not just what you bring into your house, leftovers at a restaurant, the leftovers and the scraps at that restaurant or dining facility where you went to eat, and even back to the excess on the farm fields that grew the food that we consumed. So we all play a role in this challenge. And so what we want to think about doing is, and what I want to spend most of my time today thinking about is like what we can do about it. I also like to share this visualization. So this is the Rose Bowl Stadium. And if you want to think about the magnitude of food that we waste, I want you to imagine this football stadium filled to the top every day for a year. So that's like kind of a visual, our best guess of how much food we waste in the United States. And it's a notoriously tricky thing to quantify. It's hard to ask people how much food they waste because they don't really want to tell you. It's hard to go into factories and measure this. But based on our best estimate, it's over 100 million tons a year in the U.S. So that's a lot of waste. But it's also a lot of resource that we could be doing other things with, including feeding people or making other resources. Now, why we're really concerned about this from an environmental standpoint is that not only is all of that waste mean we're wasting those water, fertilizer, energy, and chemical inputs at the beginning, we're also then creating environmental impacts at the end of the chain. So if you look at the average municipal solid waste in the United States, about 50% of what we throw away is material we would call organic. So carbon-based. It's things that could be composted or used, and about over 20% of that is food scraps alone. And so this is, again, the average. You know, some folks waste more, some folks waste less, some people compost, but in general, the average is at about 20% of what we throw away is food waste. And when that food waste ends up in the landfill, which is where the vast majority of it goes, in the U.S., landfilling is our primary waste management alternative, it starts to break down. Now, if you think about a landfill, a bunch of stuff piled in and capped off, there's no oxygen. You know, it's an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment. And in that environment, when food waste breaks down, it produces methane. Now, we know that methane is a greenhouse gas that has about 25 to 30 times the climate impact of carbon dioxide. So when we're throwing all this resource away, and then we're creating a new climate problem. So you can see that there's a lot of motivation to really try to both prevent what goes into waste, but also then to do something else with it that might be more valuable. And so when we think about what we want to do with food waste, I like to refer to this diagram that was put forward by the U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, that they call the wasted food scale. I kind of think it looks like a horseshoe, but they call it the scale, so that's what we'll go with. And the way to interpret this is to think about the areas in dark green on what I guess would be your left viewing this being the most preferable. And then as you go around and you get over to the other side being the least preferable. So one of the things you'll notice is you don't automatically jump to something like composting. First, we're trying to prevent wasted food. The biggest environmental and sustainability benefits come from keeping the waste from occurring to start. And then if we do have excess food, I'm not even talking about waste here, I'm just talking about surplus that is still healthy, nutritious, good food. Get it to people who need to eat it or who want it or for whom it is culturally appropriate to eat and use. So that keeps it in the food system. So it's not a waste, it's just it's a valuable product. Then we can say, well, could we do something else with it that keeps it in the food system? And one of those is through, a lot of interventions in the agricultural side, especially feeding animals. If you look at the amount of cropland we use in the US, a lot of the resources that go into agriculture, the vast majority of it goes to feed animals, cattle mostly, growing soy, corn, wheat, and things like that that go into animal feed. So one of the things we can do is we can take some surplus food and convert it back into nutritious food for animals, which solves two problems. And then if you can't get any more use out of it in the food system, then we look at ways to convert it. We're not necessarily saying recycle here, because recycle sort of implies you're taking an aluminum can and recycling it back into aluminum that might go into a new can. We can't really recycle food waste back into food most of the time, although there are some ways that you can upcycle it. But what we're talking about here is what we call valorization or value, recovering the value in that food waste through things like compost and anaerobic digestion. So this was sort of a big overview. And what I want to do with most of the time today is really kind of unpack each of these different strategies, but in a very practical way. So you can think about ways that you can maybe apply some of these things in your own lives. And some of you might already be doing that, which is awesome. So then your job is to help share and evangelize these solutions to the people in your community, because we really want to try to help people understand about things that we can do to reduce and manage food waste. All right, so I'm going to start with, the very first thing we could say is to figure out where to put these solutions is like, where is the food actually being wasted? So when we think about food waste, the images like this might come to mind. A little bit of stuff left on your plate, that bag of spinach you bought after New Year's, the best of intentions of eating healthy that just wilted away in the crisper drawer. I mean, maybe just me. So that's kind of what comes to mind when we think about food waste. But really, food waste comes from the entire food system. Now, households are the biggest chunk of that. About, in the yellow, you see here, 43% of food waste comes directly from households. And this is particularly a challenge because households of all these different actors have the least options about what to do with it. If you were as a household, you're like, I can't take my food waste to an anaerobic digestion facility. What can I do with it? So much of the actions that can be put in place are further upstream. But even though they're not happening at a household, consumers play a big role in many of these. So if we think about a big chunk comes from grocery and distribution. Well, some of that waste comes from things like produce that we chose not to buy, or it comes from, grocery stores who large grocery stores put on a really large abundance of products because people like to have a lot of choice when they're buying food. Much of that ends up going to waste. And it also comes from the distribution of food. So when we choose to consume food outside of its seasonality, it then is more likely to spoil or to get damaged along the way because we have to transport it in farther. So our consumption choices lead to some of the waste that happens in these different places. The same we could say about restaurants, or what we call like institutional, which would be cafeterias, schools, hotels, hospitals, jails, things like that. So a lot of that waste in both of these two categories here at the bottom also comes from our consumption choices. One of the interesting studies they've done at university cafeterias is that if you give students a tray in an all-you-can-eat facility, they waste more food because they can pile more onto it. And then when they get back to their table, they're not actually that hungry. So one of the very simple interventions we've seen a lot of universities do is just say you can come as many times up to the buffet as you want, but you're just going to have a plate. So you fill up what you can put on a plate the first time around, and then if you're hungry, you come back. And even simple changes like that make a huge amount of difference in terms of waste. So again, it's not necessarily happening in our household, but we are in many times responsible for this. And then even things like losses on farms, sometimes that can be due to adverse weather, climatic events, storms and damage. But sometimes that's just a mismatch between what consumers want and what farmers are growing. A great example of this is like pumpkins. We all want a beautiful pumpkin or gourd, on our table at come Halloween and Thanksgiving in the fall time. But if they're not grown, if they don't peak at just the right time, consumers are done. It comes December 1, who wants a pumpkin? So the farmers any that are left, what are we going to do with them? Now, fortunately, in the case of agriculture, much of that can be plowed back into the ground and go back into nourishing the soil, but it is still a cost for farmers. And all of these wastes add up to dollars. So every time there's a loss or a waste, that gets added onto your food bill. And so one of the easiest ways of making food more affordable is by reducing these inefficiencies and losses. And then the other part about figuring out where waste comes from is thinking about what food we're eating. So, if you kind of think about, we have across the top here, we have different kinds of foods like grains, roots and tubers, oil crops and beans, fruits and vegetables, meat, fish, and dairy. And I'm just restating these because I know the text is a little small here. And then you have down the side the parts of the food supply chain, all the way from, agricultural production to the consumption. So one of the things you'll notice is that different foods get wasted more or less at different parts of the supply chain. So for example, grain actually has more losses upstream. This is true in the US to some extent, but in some parts of the world, much of losses happen due to food spoilage and storage. So if you're harvesting grain during part of the year and you don't have refrigerated storage, it can spoil over time. You also notice that things like meat have less loss than, say, things like fruits and vegetables. Part of that is the cost. Meats tend to be more expensive. And so, producers and people along the way are trying to get as much out of that product as possible. Like they're eking value out of every bit of it. But a lot of times, fruits and vegetables are harder to store and we end up with more losses. But again, because we're thinking about this from a sustainability perspective, I'm not trying to say don't eat your veggies and switch to meat, because there's other parts of this question. For example, if you just look at the carbon footprint of the food you eat, meats and dairy, cattle and dairy especially, have a huge carbon footprint. It's mostly because of cow farts, not to put in manure, not to put a too fine a point on it. Sustainability is a very glamorous field. But cows, as you know, have an enteric fermentation, the way their stomachs are set up. And so based on their digestion, they release a lot of methane, and so does their manure. So things like meat, beef, and dairy end up having a big carbon footprint. And many meats and dairy products have a lot of water intensity. So, one apple takes about 70 liters of water to produce. Now, that's not just the direct irrigation water, it's the whole life cycle water associated with growing it and delivering it to you. But on the other hand, a piece of cheese or a steak can be hundreds of times that. So one of the things we always are thinking about in sustainability is trade-offs. So there's no easy solution like do this, don't do that. It's kind of all about balancing trade-offs. So if we know that we're eating more of a food that wastes more, then we can put strategies in place to reduce that waste. All right, so let's talk about what some of those strategies could be. So first, I really want to talk about food waste prevention, like actually either stopping the waste before it starts or reducing that waste that actually gets discarded. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about is rethinking the need for cosmetic perfection. Now, like many of you all, I love gardening, and I always love getting weird fruits and vegetables out of my harvest because I think it is very fun. But one of the challenges that you'll notice is when you go to Wegmans, you don't see a lot of stuff like this in your choices. They have been culled out, either by the farmer, by the warehouse where the food went through before it came to Wegmans, or sometimes at Wegmans itself. And one of the things that I love to do, and surprisingly haven't gotten arrested for yet, is to watch the guy working. In the Wegmans I go to, it's a guy, but watch the person working in the produce section. And sometimes if you're ever in the produce section and notice a big green kind of looks like a trash can, that he's going around and taking things off the shelf and putting that into that. But he also has a cart. So Wegmans is pretty good about saying, oh, that product got dinged up, that got damaged. We're going to take it back to the prep kitchen and we're going to make it into like prepared foods. So they have a pretty good system. But if a store doesn't have that, they're not able to put that into place. But then we as a consumer can say, signal like, hey, like we will buy things that are maybe they're not damaged, maybe they're not rotting, but maybe there's just a cosmetic imperfection. So that's a signal we as a consumer can make. As is, getting food at farmers markets where we can get it from local suppliers, if you know that, or even, sometimes buying food from resellers. A lot of people criticize like at farmers market, oh, there's a lot of resellers there, but they're selling food that would otherwise be discarded. So I love going to the farmers market and buying the containers of Driscoll's that didn't make it to the Wegmans shelves. Where else are they going to be sold? So the next part of it is once you have the food in your house, you want to keep it as long as possible. So one of my colleagues at Ohio State University did a study on households that freeze food, and they found that the households that use freezing as a method of storing and preserving food, or even people that buy frozen produce instead of fresh produce, actually waste less. Households are much more likely to waste food out of the refrigerator than they are out of the freezer. Now, of course, you want to follow safe practices, and I've included a link here to USDA guidelines on that, because we also don't want people to get ill from preservation or freezing methods that aren't appropriate. Another one that I think is a fun option is thinking about, and this is where technology is really starting to come into play, is thinking about how to avoid waste in your own shopping and food preparation strategies. So I once saw a meme that said, being married is just texting your spouse, do we have milk every day until you die? Which I think seems fairly accurate, because I know one of us in our household is going to the grocery store, it feels like almost every day. But a lot of that is because people don't tend to really know what is in their refrigerator and what is in their pantry. And so, one of the easiest and this has been studied in almost every part of the world, in every demographic. One of the easiest ways of reducing waste is just doing more meal planning and pantry inventory before you go to the store. So taking an inventory of what you have. And then some people also say doing like a pantry clean out cook, where you say, I'm not going to cook one night. I'm not going to buy new, food one day of the week. I'm just going to go through and cook from what's in my pantry. Now, that can be a little daunting, but fortunately, technology and the proliferation of cool apps and web platforms has led to the development of many apps that allow you to put in the ingredients you have, and it'll suggest recipes for what you can do. There's even now, I think one of the things that I am interested in, because I also really love electronics, and I think a lot about where electronics and electronic waste and food might interact, is a lot of refrigerators now you can buy a camera in them. So if you're at the store, you're like, do we need eggs? You can look and see in your fridge and see if it's there. Now, this isn't like a mainstream option for fridges yet, but I think it's from what we've seen in trends in electronics design, it's coming down the pipe. So there's some options there for ways of reducing the food waste. The other big one I want to talk about is date labels. Now, have y'all ever had that situation where you're like, is this good? And then what do you do with the information on this label? Well, it turns out date labels are meaningless. Okay? The only thing that is actually by law has a meaning in terms of date labeling is baby formula. Now, different states, this is where it's kind of, there's a policy patchwork, what we call it. Policy around food and food waste is kind of a mess across the U.S. Every state has their own law about, or if they have a law about what a label can say and what has to bear a label. So in some places, you might have egg labels that say packed by or harvested by. Sometimes you'll see best before, best if used by. Some say expiration, some say freshest by. It turns out that most of these are just a brand, a company saying, I want you to experience my food when I think it is the freshest and tastes best so that you'll buy it again. They don't actually mean you cannot eat it the day after that date has gone past. And in most places, like food banks especially, like will it continue to accept canned goods and other products 6 months past the expiration date because usually it doesn't mean anything. So I think this is one of the biggest things we can do as consumers. Now, please do not sue me if you smell something funky and are like, oh, Callie said I could eat it. No, trust your smell, your taste, your touch, the appearance of food. When in doubt, if a seal has been broken, we're really not trying to say eat bad food, but usually expiration dates are not a good guideline about when to discard something, especially for foods that have preservatives, that are preserved, and that are canned and sealed and safe like that. Now, of course, there's some foods where you just know when you take a whiff, that's not going to be. So dump that spoiled milk down the sink. But otherwise, rethink how you interpret these labels. All right, so those are some of the ways that we can prevent food waste, especially in our own households. Another that I want to talk about is actually donation. Now, there's actually a lot of debate in our community about putting food donation on a wasted food scale. Because if you think about it, kind of sounds like we're saying, eat wasted food, give poor people wasted food, which is not the message we're trying to say. We're not talking about taking something that truly is waste and fobbing it off on people, although that happens. Unfortunately, many agencies that receive food donations do receive food that is not well suited for the audience. Like maybe it's not culturally relevant, or maybe it's not good, or maybe they don't have any way to store it. So a big company can pass off their waste management costs to a small donation agency if there's not more controls around this. But in general, there's a lot of different ways that we can donate food, and there's a national Good Samaritan law that is meant to protect businesses from any liability that would come from such donations. So in our area, there's definitely organizations that participate in this. I mean, FoodLink is one of the biggest, and they have many different pathways by which they're putting excess food back into the hands of people. An organization that started out of RET is called Flower City Pickers. They actually go at the public market on Saturday and glean the materials that aren't sold. Another national organization is called Too Good To Go, where you can actually go online and buy, or not even buy, you can take excess food from local restaurants. So I checked it out last night, and it had like Nino's, it had Whole Food. Like there are places where you can just say surprise bag, and you go pick it up, and you get in that bag whatever's left. So there's a lot of opportunities for getting food to people who need it. But it's also, it's a very volunteer heavy effort. So for a number of years, I had the privilege of volunteering with Agape Haven of Abundance. And they get a lot of food from Wegmans and Price Right and other grocery stores. And then they put out a community table where people can come get it. But it's also very challenging because it takes a lot of volunteer hours driving around and getting that material and then staffing that table. And then you still got waste at the end. And I would really emphasize this idea of cultural relevance because the neighborhood where they're located has families from many, many different countries. And my most memorable experience there was a mom with her kids coming up and looking at a plastic container of zucchini noodles. Which have you ever tried zucchini noodles or tried to tell us like, hey, it's just like eating pasta, but really it's just spiralized zucchini. It's not bad, but it's not pasta. But if you buy them at Wegmans, they cost way more than buying zucchini. So this mom said, what is that? We said, zucchini noodles. She said, that's not zucchini. So something that some groups would prize and pay more for, other groups may not want. And so food donation shouldn't be viewed as like a Band-Aid of just a way to get rid of excess food. It really requires that there's an organization and individuals who understand what food is needed and then get that to them. So we're getting healthy food and nutritious food back into productive use. And I would also say many of the other organizations in this area, like People's Pantry and others, that will use, a lot of their, meal prep, hot meal prep does come from excess food. And so there's lots of ways of supporting this. And even as a church, there might be opportunities there. Okay, so we have tried to prevent waste. We've tried to keep waste in or keep food in use as long as possible by getting it to people who need it. But there's always going to be some waste that's left. We might have some overproduction. We might have some spoiled pieces, bones, peelings. There's inevitably some waste. And we want to still think about that like a resource. How can we get some value back out of it? And that's where we think about food waste valorization. So the term valorization just means taking something and improving its value. So if you take something that's waste and then you can turn it into a soil amendment or an energy stream or a fuel, you're actually producing a product that with higher value than what you started with. Upcycling is sometimes another word for it. So two of the most common methods we have available to us today, especially as households, is composting. And this might either be centralized composting or at an even bigger scale, like industrial scale composting, where there's lots of material coming in and it's being carefully controlled in terms of its temperature, composition, and production, maturity rate. And then you also have a number of backyard options where you can do this in your own home in many different sizes, scales, or you can get together with neighbors. And composting is an aerobic degradation process. So that's why you're always turning your compost pile because you're trying to keep oxygen flow through it. So the bacteria involved with that need oxygen to break the food waste down. And then what you're left with is a soil amendment or a soil additive. Now, the other common method, and this is used a lot in New York, is anaerobic digestion. So anaerobic just means without oxygen. Just like in a landfill, the organisms are breaking this material down. They're also producing methane. But folks, methane is not necessarily bad. Methane is the primary constituent of the natural gas we pay for and use in our homes. So if this is happening in a controlled environment, like this bubble has the methane in it, if it's happening in a controlled environment, we can take that biogas and we can produce electricity from it. We can clean it and compress it and put it in the pipeline and use it in vehicles. So we're solving two problems at once. We're getting food waste out of the landfill and we're making bio-based energy and fuels instead of fossil fuel alternatives. So this is actually a picture of a digester that operates not too far from here. And what you'll see next to it are barns. And so this is a dairy operation, and this particular facility co-digests dairy manure and food waste. It's disgusting, but it's solving two waste problems at once. And so the dairy manure provides sort of a stability of operation, and then the food waste adds energy to the system, so it makes more electricity. And this is a facility where a lot of waste in our area goes. So while households can't necessarily drive up and hand off our waste, they receive a lot of food processing byproducts. Like if you made applesauce and it got a little glass in the container, or maybe this flavors were off, a big vat of that might go here instead of the landfill. There's also Noblehurst Energy. This is Synergy Biogas. Noblehurst Energy is another big one in our area, and they get most of Wegmans food waste. So a lot of large stores in this area are partnering here, and part of the reason is because of law. So New York State has a policy that says any commercial generator, a commercial entity that makes food waste, and if they make more than 2 tons a week, they have to send it somewhere other than the landfill. So now you've got a lot of businesses doing that, but Wegmans really was leading on that effort before it was in law. So when we think about options that are available to consumers, there is an increasing number, well, 3 and 3-ish, because there's a lot of pilot projects going on. But a few years ago, there was 0. There's an increasing number of options for consumers. So if you don't want to compost at home, and many consumers don't, they don't have the space, maybe they live in an apartment, maybe they think it's gross or don't have time or their partner doesn't support it, there's programs where you can sign up, get a bucket, put your food waste in this bucket, and someone will collect it or you can drop it off. So Rochester City has one. Impact Earth is probably the most longest established in Rochester. And Fairport has a program, and then other towns have been doing some pilot programs. I know Pittsford has been involved with one for a while. So there's some at different levels of maturity, there's some different programs like this available. Some of them are free, some you pay for. Some of them pick it up at your house and some you take it to them. So you really have to kind of be like, yeah, I want to do this to opt in. We haven't yet figured out a way to make it really quick and easy and convenient for everybody to participate, which is a big opportunity. Now, a lot of people like to compost at home. And so I won't get into all the details on how to do that because there's a lot of great resources available, two of which I've put here from the Cornell Extension as well as New York. But here you're really thinking about the main thing you need is you need some amount of space. You need some ability to mix what we call browns, which are things like leaves, wood chips, maybe like newspapers, things like that, straw, hay, and then the greens, which are your food waste. Now, why do you need that? Well, because they all have different pH, they have different amounts of carbon and nitrogen, and if you don't have a good and consistent level, you can sort of kill off the organisms that are doing the degradation for you. You have to also have to make sure it gets oxygen. So this way you don't just dumping things in a pile and leaving it, although my compost pile does look like that occasionally, but you're wanting to turn it because that's what's keeping it oxygenated and aerobic. Some people also do vermicomposting, which involves red wigglers, and this is one you can do inside. You don't want to leave them outside in the Rochester winter. But there's a lot of different ways you can make this even bigger or smaller to handle your material. And another resource I like is called the Solana Center. They're in California, but they put out a lot of great consumer-friendly resources on composting. One of the things that we've been working on lately is electric composters. Have any of y'all seen these? The Lomi or the Mill? The Mill is a big company now. They're even going in with Whole Foods. So this is basically the idea of people saying like, hey, composting sounds too hard for me. I don't want to touch that. People who've never composted think it is really gross and hard. And so now what they're seeing is a big explosion of these like home composting devices. Well, I'm going to say composting in quotation marks because what they're kind of really doing is drying the food waste. So basically the way this works is you take this lid off and there's a bucket inside and it's got some like knives in it, kind of like a blade that goes around. You put your food waste in, you close it up and it heats it up and grinds it up. And what comes out is only about 80 to 90% of the mass or volume of what you put in, and it's very dry. It doesn't smell, it's not going to rot. Now the problem is it's not really compost. It's not ready to just put into soil. It might need further processing. The other issue that we saw, we tested, so one of the projects my students have been doing is actually testing this. So we tested the Lomi under 3 modes as well as one called the Pure Sonic, and to see like how well they actually work. And one of the things you'll notice is they take a lot of electricity to run. So one of the challenges can be you're solving one problem in sustainability by keeping the food waste out of the landfill, but you might be creating a new one by using electricity. In New York, our electricity is pretty clean. It's one of the cleanest in the country, but it's still it's still lots of fossil fuels, not a great idea. So these really work best, we found, when you combine them with food waste prevention. One of the conundrums in sustainability is that when people start composting or when they're eating somewhere where they know the food is composted, they tend to waste more. There's what we sometimes call a rebound effect, where there's savings in one area means we consume more. So one of the things when we survey people, we find out is that composting makes you feel better, you feel less guilty. I don't feel as guilty about that spinach that I had to throw away. So you don't really it doesn't click. Versus wasting food makes us feel guilty and it makes us want to reduce it. So that is one thing we try to say is like we don't want to just adopt these strategies without at the same time trying to reduce our waste. The other issue that I want to talk about is contamination. So, okay, microplastics, spoiler alert, they're in your food waste too, which is probably not a big surprise because every day there's some headline about microplastics in something. Well, one of the things that we see when we work, that anaerobic digestion facility that I showed you earlier, after the food is processed, you get a biogas that I mentioned. You also get what's called digestate. So there's like all the nitrogen and phosphorus and nutrients that were in that food waste, they're still there after the digestion process converts the carbon into energy. And the material is very wet and liquid. So that gets stored into what's called a lagoon. And then it gets loaded up onto these trucks, taken out to nearby fields, and either applied or, as you can see here, sort of like injected and knifed into the soil. One of the challenges, of course, in New York is there's a pretty limited amount of time where we can actually do this because the growing season is shorter here. Um, but one of the concerns we had is like, well, if if we don't get all the plastics and contaminants out of the food waste before it goes into this facility or into a composting facility, will they come out into these soil? Because here we're growing more things, maybe not food that we're eating, but oftentimes we're growing animal feed here. And it turns out that yes, when we sampled digestate from several facilities across the US, not just here in New York, we found many, many different examples of plastics, which are circled here. And so you could see some black, this, polystyrene, you see different, this PHA, that's actually a biodegradable polymer used for like composting bags. It doesn't totally biodegrade in the facility. So even biodegradable plastics aren't always great. Some of these come from agriculture. So when you drive along the highway and you see what are called sometimes marshmallows, the plastic wrapped silage in the field, a lot of plastic used for mulching rows of crops, covering hay and silage. And then when you are working at a dairy facility like that feeds this facility, that plastic can end up getting into the material. It tears easily, little pieces rip off. But some of this comes from food packaging. Some of the microplastics come from the food itself, right? Because if it was already in the food to start, it just keeps carrying through. And so what we looked at is like, where does this contamination come from? And a lot of it comes from upstream in the food system. So we sampled a whole bunch of food waste from a lot of different sources, which you can see across the bottom here: grocery stores, restaurants, office cafeteria, K-12 and university cafeteria, and households. And these are folks that are they're actually doing the work of separating their compostables and taking them in a bucket to the Rochester City drop-off site. So they're not just like, hey, forced me to do this. Like, they're volunteering to do it. We found plastics in over 80% of the samples. Most of those are from cafeterias, schools, offices, things like that, but they're really all over the place. And we saw a lot of these so-called compostable plastics, which don't always degrade. And so if you actually kind of look at what a lot of this stuff is, and let me tell you again, sustainability is very glamorous. The student that did this project spent many, many hours literally digging piece by piece through all these plastic samples. And you see kind of a range of things. You see, containers. People just toss in there. In food service, you see a lot of gloves, which are PVC, polyvinyl chloride, which when that gets into, composting or digestion system is not good for the microorganisms. And the number one thing we saw, anybody want to guess what the number one contaminant we saw was? The most common thing? A lot of plastic bags, not the biggest. By mass, there was a lot, but by count, any other guesses? Okay, straws, some, not as common, not as much as we thought. I think a lot of places are getting rid of them. But the main thing we saw was produce stickers. These things are a real nightmare for this. Now, they're very light by mass, but they made up almost 30% of the individual items that we counted. And produce stickers, you think, well, like, why? They're like, they seem like paper, but in reality, they're paper coated with plastic, and then there's an adhesive there. And we've done some tests, and they do not break down in these systems. So one of the best things you can do if you are participating in compost, if you are doing this, taking that extra time to peel the sticker off can really help reduce some contamination. As well as, of course, here, this is really about education of food service workers, students. If you're in a student cafeteria, it's mostly students doing this. So there's a lot of opportunities here to kind of say, hey, let's think of ways of keeping this material out of our waste to start. So that was a very interesting project that we're now studying. The other thing that some of our current research is about, and over the years, I've sort of switched from really thinking about like technological solutions to sustainability to thinking more about behavioral solutions. Because the reality is, unless you can get people to change their behavior or to adopt a new technology, it's not going to work. And what we know from lots of research is just giving people more information does not work. Telling them it saves money does not work. Telling them it's good for the environment does not work. We have to think about ways of kind of nudging behavior along that will actually lead people to new to new behaviors. So one of the things that we did, and I think some of you all may have actually even taken this survey many years ago. One of my students did a survey on people in New York State, and we divided them into, we asked everybody the same questions, but then after the fact, we divided people into whether or not they were separators or non-separators. And what we mean by separators is people who are like actually doing something with food waste other than throwing it in the waste. They're separating their trash from their food waste, whether they're composting it or feeding it to animals or putting it down the dish drain. They're actually doing the task of keeping it apart. And one of the things we found is that everybody knows it's environmentally friendly and a responsible thing to do. But then when you look at this, the darker color here is the separators. They say it's easy to do. It's a family-friendly activity. And some even say it's fun. When you ask non-separators, they say it's inconvenient, smelly, and yucky. So clearly there's a divide here. Because if the people who are actually doing the behavior don't think it's that hard or yucky to do, but people who've never done it do, there's clearly an opportunity to kind of bridge that gap. So then the question is like, how do we make it more convenient, more easy, more user-friendly? And part of that is even just one of the things that we've seen is like getting people together. Like if you actually, like people tend to change their behavior when they say other people in their like groups behave in ways that if they think people would approve or if that mean something to them. So, a very easy way of, thinking about this is like helping people see other people in their own lives doing this behavior and seeing how easy it is. We also saw that people were really worried about things like pests and really interested in things like these food waste services. So people are like, yeah, if you gave me a bucket, and you could just make the dirty bucket disappear and give me a clean bucket or bag back, I'd do that. So that's kind of where all these like these bucket service programs like Rochester and Impact Earth have. But the challenge here is that consumers want a lot. First, they say we want a low weekly cost. We want them to pick it up at our house. And we want them to take the old bucket and give us a clean one. And then we want them to give us compost back at the end of this. So they want a lot. And the challenge is these don't all go together. This bucket swap program is really expensive to run. So we interviewed compost businesses across the country, and they hate it because they say we have to have way more buckets than we actually need because we're always swapping them. We have to have people whose job it is just to clean them and just constantly churning on these buckets. So now what they do is they give people bags, like degradable bags to put the compost in, which of course we say they don't always degrade. But people are like, maybe I'll use a bag. That's fine. But then they want it picked up at their house. That's a lot of cost, especially as fuel price goes up. That's a lot of labor. So there's kind of a tension between what people say they want and what they're willing to pay for. And when we looked across the country, what we found, we looked at these compost businesses across the country, and we looked at like how frequently they either come to your house or whether or not they do drop-off. So the first column is like if they come to your house every week to pick up your food waste, every 2 weeks, once a month, or if you actually have to drop it off yourself. And you can clearly see that there's a cost for convenience. Some of these services, charge up to $50 or more a month, whereas, some of them were infrequent services cost 10 or even in many cases are free. If you're willing to bring the food waste to them, they're free. So this is what a lot of what we're working on right now in our research is really trying to understand, like, are there different business models? Are there different services? How do we actually get people to sometimes participate in these activities? And we're right now working on a consumer service survey about willingness to pay. Like, how much would you really be willing to pay if this was your option? And the reason this is a big challenge is because people perceive waste management as free. It's not really free. It's in our taxes usually, or in our municipal, or sometimes we pay directly. I'm in a refuse district, which means it comes out of my taxes. So I'm not writing a check each month saying, here's the cost of my waste. And I don't have to pay any less if I reduce my waste. If I pay more for food waste, I don't save money on the waste. So that's where policy can also come in. There's a number of places in the country and around the world where you have pay as you throw. So you might actually pay a different amount depending on what size garbage can you get. Or there's, places that even ban food waste from residents. We see this in Vermont and California, but it hasn't taken effect here in New York. And there's some challenges with that. So there's a lot of different knobs we can turn. But the point that I really want to make is that for food waste, because it's such a complex challenge, it really is going to take a whole ecosystem of solutions across this entire scale to try to do something about it. So we have to prevent, donate, valorize all together and orchestrate these in such a way that a solution in one space doesn't lead to, say, more waste in another. Now, we do get questions like, what if I put it down my disposal? In EPA's view, that's not really any better than landfill or incineration, but there is some evidence that it might be a small improvement if you live in an area where there is wastewater treatment facilities that can accept it. Because you're basically putting a lot more organic load through, and they have to have the ability to accept that. And hopefully, they also will have some energy recovery. That's probably more common in California than parts here. Our infrastructure tends to be a little bit more dated, so they don't want to just say like, "Yeah, everybody put food waste down the sink." But I think in general, the idea is, minimize the time we spend at the end of this section, or minimize the amount of food that actually goes through these and maximize what we're doing on the most preferred side. Okay, I will stop there and happy to answer any questions or hear maybe if folks even want to share what they're doing in this space, or if you have questions about any of these topics or really any sort of waste things that we mentioned, I'm happy to answer.
I do compost. Even in the winter, I walked in knee-deep snow out to my compost pile. I saw a really quick slide about meat and bones.
Yeah.
I know you're not supposed to put meat in it, but I wondered about bones.
So you'll see different. So this is like New York. Maybe this is the one you mentioned. And Nancy, I think you are going to be our compost ambassador. You're going to be the one out there, like showing people that it can be done. It's not that hard. In general, I think the general school of thought is that in a household, in a backyard compost pile, the temperatures and usually don't get high enough. And you're not like mixing, like in a lot of industrial facilities, they're heated, it's a much bigger mass, so it gets very hot and so things degrade a little bit faster and better. It's not saying they won't degrade, but it might just not happen over the time scale that a at-home person would be doing. So in general, I think you're trying to keep out of it things that, sometimes meat and things like that can lead to pests or maggots, so that can turn people off. It's not the end of the world, but that's a downside for a lot of people. So I think in general, we want to keep things out that are very hard to digest. And even with organic material like, the browns here, even like reducing their size to make them easier to digest can help. Like, one of the things that I sometimes do is put some of my leaves in a trash can and run the weed whip through it to kind of just pre-break them down a little bit. So sometimes you can like reduce the size of some of these materials to make them degrade at a rate that's comparable to the food waste that's there, which will degrade very quickly.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks so much. A couple months ago, I heard that Chobani had partnered with Ivanka Trump to kind of divert some of the stuff that they weren't selling. What's that all about?
I don't know about Chobani in specific, but I do know that interestingly, if we go back a few slides, food processing facilities are not usually like this manufacturer block. They're not necessarily the biggest piece of the pie, but they're very motivated to reduce and do something else with waste because it's a cost to them. I mean, that's the other thing about this. You can get people, we try to get people to care about food waste, whether they care about the environment or not. Because for most businesses, waste is a cost. You pay what's called a tipping fee to have it hauled off. And because food waste is wet, it's heavy. And so your tipping fee is higher. And businesses are like, I don't even care about the environment, but if I could just reduce those costs, it'd be a good thing. Plus, when you're wasting something, you're wasting the money you spent on your feedstock, your raw materials. So a lot of businesses are really motivated into looking into alternatives. And yogurt, tofu, dairy products are really a large concern in this area because we have so much production. New York has actually a surprising amount of dairy production, but they're challenging waste to manage because they're very acidic. And so I don't specifically know the
I think that
example.
we're really talking more about the fruit stuff that goes
Oh,
into it.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, in fruit, you see a lot of interesting things. Wineries do a lot of things with what we call a pumice, which is like the seeds and the skins. You know, wineries, one of my favorite stories is the winery that produces the Manischewitz wine in Canandaigua. Um, because of that process, that wine doesn't sell for particularly high price, but all of the grape skins and seeds and things like that then get shipped to a company in California that extracts what is it called? Like resveratrol. I'm probably saying it wrong, but it's some sort of like antioxidant that is in supplements and skincare. Sells at a higher price than the wine because it's like a very high demand like supplement that you can take. So any kind of thing that's left, any waste, any food waste, whether it's from the yogurt or dairy or the fruit, there is carbon, there's nitrogen and phosphorus, there's water, and those are the building blocks of basically all chemicals that we use. So one of the things we talk a lot about is this idea of a food waste biorefinery. So just like in an oil refinery, you bring crude oil in and then you got all these petroleum products out. You can do the same thing with waste. So a lot of companies, you see everything like Love Beets is one that's doing a lot of work and they make like flour. They make like a beet flour out of it. A lot of companies doing a lot to try to eke out value. So instead of taking a waste that's a cost, create a revenue, like actually make a product that you can sell. So there's a lot of cool examples like that around this area. And, Cornell plays a big role in that as well.
I think there's an ad that it's impressed me anyway, and it's just don't waste food. And every time I open my refrigerator and I think, what am I going to use here today?
Yeah.
And well, I had that yesterday, but I have gotten to the point where I'll use that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, years ago when you were here speaking, I wanted to ask you a question about my garbage disposal.
Yeah.
But Jim Reese beat me to it. And you said, don't use the garbage disposal. That's bad. And
Yeah.
so I try not to use it that
Yeah.
much anymore.
I mean, it's challenging. It's a challenging thing. Personally, I think based on the evidence and the data I've seen, the garbage disposal can still be better than landfill. But the problem is it depends, which is like the first thing you learn in sustainability school is that the answer is always it depends. So a lot of it depends on what facilities are in your area and what they do. So if your food waste is going to a landfill and that landfill is capped, covered, has a landfill gas recovery unit, much of the methane that's produced will actually itself right there be produced into energy. Versus if it's going to a wastewater treatment facility with a big open lagoon, which is where, the disposal would go, that could lead to greenhouse gases being emitted. Or vice versa. It could be going through a disposal that it could be going through the wastewater treatment system to an area where they're actually recovering those and making, biofuels with it. But the problem is most consumers don't have that information. So I would say, like, in general, what we try to say is just if you can avoid those end of the pipe solutions to the extent possible and just shift the effort upstream, that's always going to be a better win. But there's pros and cons to both of those. So it really just depends on where the waste is going. And it's really hard to say, I don't even know where mine goes all the time.
I really want to ask about something maybe a little bit beyond the food aspect of recycling. And that is these huge landfills where all the garbage trucks from New York are coming up to go to the place in Seneca County and the one that's on the border of Monroe County and Wayne County are those heavily they are heavily regulated, but is there much recovery from that, or are those pretty much just permanent because there's huge mix of things that go into those landfills and they're run by commercial operators, obviously, who are meticulous about staying within the regulation, but beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Oh, whenever my family travels, they always tease me because we'll be driving along. I was like, oh, look, there's a landfill. And they're like, how did you know? I was like, It's got the slanted side, it's got the pipe sticking out. You can always kind of tell when you see a land. I mean, I love that. Same as whenever like you see delivery trucks or waste trucks, you'll probably notice they never turn left. My family always gets a kick out of me mentioning that because that's the number one rule in in routing and environmental like routing is that you never turn left because then you're idling and you're wasting gas. But anyway, so yeah, so I think there's kind of some broader points to your question. I mean, there is a concept called landfill mining. People have sort of said, hey, at some point we're going to not turn to mines in the ground to get resources. We're going to mine our landfills because there's some materials like gold is more concentrated in electronic waste than it is in natural gold ores. So we've said like maybe in the future we will mine things from landfill. Right now, that's not happening. What is happening is what we call like there is the leachate that comes out is often captured and treated, and the methane that's produced is often captured and either used to produce energy or what's called flaring, which they burn it. Now, that's not a great thing, but when you burn it, you're producing carbon dioxide, which is still better than methane. So it's the less bad thing. But yeah, not much is being recovered from the landfill itself, but some is being recovered from what's called the MRF. So people are saying, I followed the recycling truck and it went to the same place as my trash. Well, yeah, they all go to what's called a material recovery facility. And a lot of these literally work by stuff getting dumped out and forklifts pushing things in different directions. So there is some separation that happens at that point and some material gets recovered. But once it's in the landfill, we've thrown away all those valuable resources. So if we can keep stuff out of the landfill, that's the best solution.
Callie, you have been so organized.
Were there
I mean,
any-
just looking at this right here and referencing back to that, I think is really important in the way you've
Sure.
arranged your whole talk
Thank you.
around that process.
Were
I
there
think
any
has been
questions
wonderful.
online that I should answer?
The comment online I really want you to hear is excellent presentation. Thank you, Callie, from Marie.
Thank you, Marie.
One thing I've been thinking about is leftovers have gotten a really bad name, and I love leftovers. They save so much time. They make dinner a snap. If somehow we could re-educate people to think, John and I went to a New York kitchen where you cook and then you can take your leftovers home. And I heard someone say, I hate leftovers. I'm going to leave mine here. And it's like, this wonderful food. How could anybody hate leftovers?
Love
But I think there are a lot of people that,
Yeah.
You
And
know,
one of my hardest things is when I travel for work, because I, do travel a lot, and then you go to the restaurant and you haven't eaten all the food, they take you out to dinner, and I'm thinking, I have to go back to a hotel. Maybe there's a fridge and maybe not. There's not a microwave usually. So I'm like, oh, I can't take my leftovers. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that we're locked into. We sort of think it's this idea of like lock-in consumption. There's a lot that we can't change because the way our buildings are built, the way our systems are built, the way our schools and facilities operate, there's a lot that we as consumers can't do. But what we can do, things like using leftovers is always a good thing to do.
and someone who I go out to eat with sometimes always remembers to bring their own leftover container. What a great idea. And I always forget. I've never done it. And I think,
And it's also a good strategy. I think, we talk a lot about portion. I mean, there's a lot of also strategies that are like win-wins for the planet and for your health. Like if you think about going out to eat and there's a very large portion size, I mean, sometimes you say, oh, I'll go ahead and ask for the leftover box at the beginning and portion out what I want to eat now and what I want to take and then go home. Same as like serving food on a smaller plate size. If you're trying to eat more healthily or eat like more fruits and vegetables, like putting that on a smaller plate, usually you eat less, but then you also waste less. But not saying that people need to eat less, but just if those are your goals or objectives, sometimes there's ways you can have win-wins.
see, we could do this all day and we can't. But one thing I want to say, no Sunday Forum next week or the week after because it's Palm Sunday and Easter. And then the Sunday after Easter, we're going to start with more environmental or continue with more environmental programs. And I don't remember exactly what the next one is, but we'll let you know. Food Link,
Cool.
which Callie talked about. So we need to get to church. Thank you so much. So we're